I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, a conversation with Canada's outgoing prison watchdog on why he's calling it quits 2 years early.
I leave with a fair amount of frustrations. And I got to tell you, I'm leaving about 2 years earlier than the end of my term. And if I would have been in a situation where the agency subject to my oversight would have been more responsive, maybe I would have stuck around for another 2 years.
That was Canada's Correctional Investigator, Ivan Zinger, at a news conference on November 12th. His job is much like that of an auditor. He looks into issues in the prison system and writes extensive reports on what is and isn't working. Since being appointed to the job in 2017, he's brought attention to countless issues within Canada's prison system. Issues that include the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women, the use of isolation cells, and the lack of mental health programs for inmates. And after 8 years on the job and 3 decades in the public service, he's leaving his post 2 years early. In his final report, he called for an overhaul of mental health services in federal corrections, arguing that they're ill-equipped to provide long-term care. Zinger joins me now to share more about his legacy and the challenges of pushing for change in a system that's often willfully resistant to it. Ivan Zinger, it's a pleasure to have you on InFocus. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
First off, you're leaving your job early, and in your annual statement you said, and I quote, "Holding the CSC, the Correctional Service of Canada, accountable for mismanagement, unfair decisions, and human rights violations has not been without its toll," unquote. So that's quite a statement. I'm wondering if you could explain what you meant and where you're coming from.
Well, given that it's my last annual report, it provided me with a platform to sort of express basically my views and feelings over the last 20 years. I have to say that those sentiments of frustrations are not uncommon among my peers. Other ombuds offices feel very much the same way, because our powers, which I accept, are great when it comes to investigation. So I have no issues about the authorities that I have to investigate complaints and to conduct systemic investigation. But in the end, despite those great authorities, my mandate is limited to making recommendations to primarily the Correctional Service of Canada, in my case, or the Minister of Public Safety or the government. So that's part of the role and frustration of an ombudsman, is that as long as the agency subject to your oversight is playing ball and willing to entertain recommendations and move forward with implementation of some of them by acknowledging some of the issues, then that's great. But if you have an organization that systematically dismisses your recommendation, I think ombuds offices have a much harder, it's much tougher.
Mm-hmm. So you say, this systematically dismissing your recommendations. Can you give us some examples of some issues that your office pushed for but didn't get moved forward?
Well, first I should distinguish, because my office has a very good batting average when it comes to making recommendations on individual complaints. So when my investigators go to institution, to penitentiaries, and try to resolve issues and engage various wardens, we do well there. The problem stem more when we conduct systemic investigation in an attempt to get to the root causes of the problems. And those recommendations are then made primarily to the Commissioner of Corrections, sometime to the Minister, and sometime to, we've done some that went beyond the Minister of Public Safety. So that's where we don't do so well. So for years and years, we've now have accomplished many systemic investigation trying to resolve issues. and those have not yield the best results. So, for example, with respect to Indigenous corrections, since my office was created back in 1973, we made 80 different recommendations in our past annual reports, and very few of them have been taken upon by the Correctional Service of Canada. And over the years, the situation has actually deteriorated. And despite all those recommendations and the best effort from Correctional Service of Canada to try to ameliorate the treatment of prisoners in federal corrections, we find that correctional outcome have not budged and in many cases deteriorated.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned those 80 recommendations that you made in your annual report about Indigenous corrections. What are a few of them that you think are the most pressing?
Well, first I have to tell you, corrections often tells me that they're not responsible for who is sent to penitentiary, so those who receive sentences of 2 years or more. But I have to tell them that they are responsible to trying to improve correctional outcomes for those Indigenous prisoners. And that's where they have failed quite systematically. So when we look at Indigenous prisoners, they're more likely to be incarcerated in higher security, in maximum security, for example. They're more likely to spend a lot more time in jail compared to non-Indigenous people with similar sentences. They're more likely to be placed in what is now called structured intervention units, which is the former administrative segregation regime. They're more likely to be involuntarily transferred away from their community. They are more likely to attempt suicide. They're more likely to be subject to use of force. They're more likely to, for example, self-harm. And when it comes to parole, they're more likely to have their parole revoked or suspended than non-Indigenous people. So all those correctional outcomes have not improved despite efforts and great deal of resources. So there's got to be a different way to improve those outcomes. And that's why we've made a lot of recommendations to trying to find those alternatives that would yield better results. And that's the focus on all our work.
So I want to kind of go a bit backwards for listeners who maybe aren't super familiar with this. Can you describe sort of a day in the life of your job, or even a year in the life? I know there's kind of things that are happening long term. What were some of the things that you're doing in this role?
There's not much of a job descriptions for my job, except my role is described in legislation in fair amount of details, and my role is to investigate complaints of offenders. That's the key role, and more generally, it refers to investigating problems of offenders. So we have my office is a small office, less than 50 people, with a budget of now it's going to be close to $7 million. And what we do is that we have investigators that go to penitentiaries or receive communications via 1-800 number, and we try to respond to those complaints. And we receive, on average, anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 complaints. The beauty is that we are completely independent from Correctional Service of Canada. I don't report to the Minister of Public Safety. My reports get tabled, as you know, before Parliament as a true ombuds office. And we've decided, I would say, about 17, 18 years ago, to invest in conducting systemic investigations. and that allows us to look at much more focused issues. So over the courses of the last 17 or 18 years, we've done systemic investigation on pretty much every aspect and operations of Correctional Service of Canada. So we looked at, of course, at Indigenous corrections. We looked at women's corrections. We looked at the treatment of Canadians of African descent or Blacks. We looked at suicide, at administrative segregation. We even look at things that are somewhat sensitive and difficult to investigate, like sexual coercion and violence among prisoners in penitentiaries. And of course, the latest annual report was entirely focused on mental health. So there's been no shortage of systemic investigation to conduct. We looked at even education, we looked at programming, we looked at vocational training, and made recommendations for improvements. And the frustration that I speak about is the fact that most of my recommendations to try to improve the system have received rather lukewarm responses from Correctional Service of Canada. And it's difficult in any of these areas to find an area where Correctional Service of Canada shines and does excessively well, especially when you compare to other jurisdictions. That's been my challenge.
And so, as you mentioned, you did the report topic on mental health, but I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about why specifically you chose that topic to focus on.
Well, two things. I would say this is an area that personally I have invested a lot of my time dealing with in terms of academia. So I actually, when I started my career now 30 years ago, I actually, my first public service job, full-time job, was with Correctional Service of Canada. And I was very lucky and privileged to be able to complete my PhD in psychology of criminal conduct, which, sort of for me was an issue that remained of great interest over my career. So we certainly did a lot of work over the years on the delivery of mental health by Correctional Service of Canada in terms of quality and access. So, as I say, it's been of a particular interest to me just because of my academic background. And the second reason we sort of decided to do this is that last year in our annual report, we highlighted an egregious death in custody that happened at a regional treatment centers, which is a psychiatric hospital operated by Correctional Service of Canada in the Ontario region. And we were so shocked about what happened to this man that when we dug into the why this that happened, it became abundantly clear that there was some systemic issues here with respect to the governance of those regional treatment centers. So that certainly prompted us to say, okay, maybe we need to focus entirely our report on access and quality of mental health care. So our annual report in the end looked at 6 different topics, including the management of those regional treatment centers. But we also looked at cognitive deficit. We looked at discharge planning, so how individuals are reintegrated back into the community when they have mental health concerns. We look also at Indigenous mental health and seeing if there was an attempt by the service to tailor their services to better respond to their mental health and well-being. So these are the kinds of things that we've been investigating. And for me, it was almost, I started with sort of the privilege of doing my PhD at Correctional Service Canada. And for me, it was a nice way to close my career and having a bit of a legacy for the work that I have focused most of my professional career.
You've also advocated to move some of the corrections traditional work outside the prison system, for example, to healing lodges, and in the case of mental health issues, sending prisoners to mental health facilities. But I'm wondering, how are these recommendations received throughout the years?
Yeah, so I think that's been one of the biggest challenges that corrections is not an organization that is sort of open to look at alternatives, especially when those alternatives required reallocation of their budget. And that's true for both Indigenous corrections, but also mental health. So, for example, there are two types of healing lodges. There are healing lodges that are operated by Correctional Service of Canada. There's 4 of them with bed capacity totaling about 250. And then there's this much better alternative that was created back in 1992 when the Correctional and Conditional Release Act came into force that allow the Minister of Public Safety to enter into agreement with either Indigenous communities or Indigenous organization for the care, custody, and supervision of Indigenous people. And that is done via, MOUs that are signed and the establishment of those healing lodges. And those are done under Section 81. So when I talk about Section 81, that's the ones operated by Indigenous communities or Indigenous organizations. And there are 6 such agreements with a bed capacity of 139 beds. So unfortunately, that's those healing lodges, sort of the ones that we most favored, that are more consistent with reconciliation, self-government, and self-determination, are those healing lodges only capture about 2% of the Indigenous incarcerated population. There are probably around 4,500 right now, Indigenous incarcerated people in federal corrections, representing about a third of all prisoners in federal penitentiaries. And that's grossly inadequate. So that recommendations that we've made is corrections should reallocate a significant portion of its budget to create new bed capacity and also enter into new agreements, as well as turning over the 4 healing lodges operated by corrections to Indigenous communities or organizations. So we've made those recommendations over the years. Probably now our initial systemic investigation of the biggest one we've done was in 2013. And it was my predecessor, Howard Sapers, who had a table before Parliament as a special report. And I did a follow-up to that report 10 years later in 2023. And that's where we focus all our energy. So that is one way that we would see a better chance of having impact on those correctional indicators that I've mentioned before, or performance targets that I've mentioned before. With respect to mental health, a similar approach. We don't believe that, despite the service stating that those regional treatment centers are designated as psychiatric hospitals and are accredited, they are not functioning as such. At best, they are providing intermediate care units with some capacity to respond to acute cases on the short term. So again, we've made the argument that to be consistent with human rights obligations, that correction should again reallocate its current budget to transfer those individuals. So those are the acutely psychiatric patients those who are suicidal or self-harm, to provincial outside community psychiatric hospitals so that they can benefit from proper quality of care.
So I wanted to move to a bit of a different topic. So back in 2023, Kathy Neal was hired as the Deputy Commissioner of Indigenous Corrections, and that's a position that your office has advocated for since 2001. And I'm wondering, would you mark that as an accomplishment?
Yes, it's definitely, we made the recommendation primarily because we recognize that as the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal correction kept going up. So back in the early 2000, it was the percentage of Indigenous people in federal correction was about 13, 14%. It is now 33%. So it was already considered a crisis back in the early 2000s, this gross overrepresentation. We considered that it was important that at the executive table, that the commissioner had a person dedicated sole responsibilities for Indigenous corrections. So we've made that recommendation, as you said, for many, many years. And it's only with, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation and the action plan that derive from that initiative, and the inquiry into murdered and missing women and girls, that we saw, our recommendation getting more traction. And eventually, the government had no choice but to force the service to adopt that recommendation. So it's now been about 2 years now that the position has been filled, and we hope that it will have some significant impact. We have, when it comes to healing lodges, despite the urgency that my office has voiced in our latest 10-year update of Spirit Matters, our systemic investigation on Indigenous corrections, we haven't yet seen concrete improvements, whether it's on correctional outcomes or the numbers of beds for healing lodges, or the numbers of agreements that have been signed. So I'm aware that they are working on it, but we have yet to see anything concrete.
Mm-hmm. And so you said in your 2022 report that the people who oversee Canada's prisons don't, quote, accept that it has any role or influence on reversing the perpetual crisis of Indigenous overrepresentation in Canadian jails and prisons. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that statement and what you're meaning by that.
For the past 30 years, governments, whether conservatives or liberals, have been unable to stop that trend of overrepresentation, or even better, to reverse that trend. And they have made commitments to try to address it. They have invested efforts, legislation, all sorts of initiatives. The latest one is the Department of Justice Indigenous Justice Strategy, but none of the efforts have actually been able to, again, to stop that trend or to reverse that trend. So it's not a great file, in a sense that even in social science, to have such a predictable trend is quite rare, where things get worse year after year after year after year. And that's what we've seen when it comes to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. Some of your viewers may know the Supreme Court of Canada decision of Gladue that dates back from 1999. Well, back then, the Supreme Court of Canada said, something to the effect that Aboriginal people constituted closer to 3% of the population of Canada and amounted to 12% of all federal inmates. And it considered those figures problematic. And they said that those figures, and I'm going to quote here, are stark and reflect what may fairly be termed a crisis in the Canadian criminal justice system. So, 25 years later, when it was considered a crisis at 12%, we are now at 33%. So that's extraordinary. In fact, I would say that if Canada somehow was able to ensure that there was no overrepresentation with respect to Indigenous people in federal corrections or in custody in general, and we were able to, if the Indigenous population is about 5% in Canada, in society in Canada, and the representation would be 5%, we would have incarceration rates that would be a kind of some of the best one in the world, like Scandinavian countries, much, much lower incarceration rates. So this is why I think there's a need and a strong desire to try to address that overrepresentation. And if you can actually reduce that overrepresentation, because you can use that overrepresentation as a barometer to gauge our success and failures in addressing the treatment of Indigenous people in Canadian society at large. If you can reduce the incarceration rates, that would mean that you're probably are at the front end doing things better, like housing, like education, like access to healthcare, and enabling Indigenous people in Canadian society to benefit from the same socioeconomic, cultural, political rights that non-Indigenous people tend to benefit from. So I think that's if you want the challenge here.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission helping, some of the recommendations gain traction. What role has Indigenous advocacy and grassroots activism, outside the corrections system played in, pushing for change in the system or, helping these recommendations gain traction?
I'm not sure I'm in the best position to respond to that question, but I will tell you that when my predecessor, Howard Sapers, issued that special report back in 2013, the reception, even by the government, which was at that time, it was a conservative government, was quite dismissive. In fact, when the report was tabled, and we only, in the history of my office, we only issued 3 special reports to Parliament. So when the report was tabled, the Minister of Public Safety at the time, which was Stockwell Day, stood up in the House and tabled the report, and basically made the comment that there's no discrimination in Correctional Service of Canada. So it was a real uphill battle. And so when it was time for me to look at if anything changed in the last 10 years, and we conducted a massive systemic investigation. We interviewed more than 225 people. Among them were about 55 elders. We spoke to so many people, whether wardens, Indigenous liaison officers, program people, community people, and so forth. So when we issued that report, it was sort of abundantly clear that we needed to do better to ensure that it would add pressure to the service to effect change. And there was also a sense of urgency that report for me, because things were just getting worse. So what we did, we actually were successful at our press conference to be joined by the three leaders of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. And in order to get more attention to the issues, and they were all in agreement that the current system isn't working for Indigenous people, and that more needed to be done, including that Corrections Canada had to divest significant control, authority, and resources to Indigenous communities and organizations. So that wasn't easy to pull off, to get the ITK president, the Métis president, and we at that time the EFN had interim chief, so we had the regional chief for Quebec and Labrador that came to the table and joined us at the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. But despite this is what's continuing to be extraordinary. We have yet to see, and this is over 2 years now, any sort of significant concrete action on the part of the service to respond to our recommendations.
So I wanted to close with this question. Given what you and your predecessors were up against, what advice would you give for the next correctional investigator?
Well, part of my decision to leave early was also a recognition that not just, I was frustrated that not sufficient improvements had been made, but it was also a recognition that perhaps someone else could take on the role, have a different lens, and and may succeed where I have not succeeded or failed to get more traction on these issues and more concrete steps. So I think I'm quite happy with the legacy of the work that I've done in the last 9 years as the head of the Correctional Investigator's Office. I'm very proud of the time that I spent with my predecessor, Howard Sapers. And in the end, the body of work that we've done, despite the fact that Corrections has not endorsed many of our recommendations, the fact remains that the body of work is now being used in the courts to effect change through litigation, class action lawsuits. And I think that's unfortunately an indirect way of having influence, because I would much more prefer the Correctional Service of Canada and the Government of Canada to be proactive in response to our findings and recommendations. So it's too bad that it has to go to court to have the influence it should have. So I think the challenge of my successor will be to try to see if there's any other way to have a more impact in terms of the fabulous work that my team of investigators and policy people and intake officers and use of force analysts do on a daily basis, and see how he or she can improve federal corrections by influencing and ensuring that we are more persuasive at convincing corrections to change direction.
Ivan Zinger, thank you so much for your time and candidness today, and sharing this incredible legacy that you've brought to corrections, and just wishing you all the best in this next chapter of your life.
Thank you very much, Cierra, and thank you for having me on your show.
APTN News InFocus also invited the Minister of Public Safety, Gary Anandasangri, and both Anne Kelly, the Commissioner of the Correctional Service of Canada, and Kathy Neal, the Deputy Commissioner of Indigenous Corrections, to be interviewed for this episode. None of those officials, including the minister, made time to answer questions about the prison system on InFocus. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.